Welcome to another show of the Research to Reps Roundtable. I am your co-host, Dr. Pat Ivey, and it is good to see my other co-host. It's been a minute since we've recorded, and I just want to say hello. Ted, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. And yourself?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I'm doing fantastic. I'm excited. Uh, Ernie, Dr. Reimer, what's happening?
You know what? It's glorious right now. That's what's happening. I mean, the sun's shining in Kentucky. Baseball season's getting started for U of L. You know, it's about to get started for Max and me. And this is the time of year where we talk about baseball a lot in our recordings, but we can save that for later. I'm really excited to introduce everyone to Daniel Martinez, an old friend and colleague of mine. Daniel, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you guys for having me on.
Awesome. I'm going to ask the first question, and Daniel, you probably think it's coming to you. I'm going to ask Ernie the first question. What are you working on?
You know what? I'm working on figuring out how to manage a sport science staff. That's probably what's on my mind. We have rapidly grown from 2 sport scientists to having a staff of 7. These are paid positions here at U of L, and just trying to make sure that we can create really awesome experiences for the sports scientists, but most importantly, provide the highest value to athletics. So that's what I've been working on the most lately. And I might throw that back at you, Pat, and ask a question like, and what experiences have you had, and what advice would you give me or others out there who are trying to grow a staff that was previously small and is starting to grow, and how do you build that to make it successful?
That is a deep question, and we're not going to use this entire podcast to answer that question. You have people and processes that have to get in alignment. So you have to, with people, there's relationships, there's trust, there's communication, there's a way of doing things, that personalities, there's all of that mixed up with the prior way of doing things and what was comfortable. So how do you implement something new? You got new ideas, new processes, new people, integrating with people that were already in place. And what you're bringing to the table may not be what they asked to be brought to the table. So it's a lot. And it takes a special person with the right amount of charisma, wisdom, to be able to bring that together. And when I say those words, I think of someone like Ted. So Ted, what are you working on?
Well, I just got back from the Senior Bowl, so it was a lot of player evaluation. So you try to make sense of what are the important metrics to evaluate when you're looking at prospects. So how does the elite eye for talent mesh up with the analytic metrics for player evaluation? I've always found that of interest, and I think it's an ongoing process to merge those two.
So, Ernie, I think you were getting ready to say something.
I like what you're saying there, and I know that, Daniel, you have a lot of experience assessing athletes. I know that you're a really big proponent of force plates. So, like, in your experience, Daniel, like, what have you seen with like the assessments you've done with force plates or other assessments that seems to translate really well to real life sport performance during competition?
Yeah, so let me walk that back a little bit, if you guys will indulge me, because what Pat said really resonated with me, because I feel a lot of that. And I call it disruptive engagement, because you're trying to disrupt status quo, but on another hand, you're trying to engage people. So it's like it can come off adversarially, but it's ultimately with the intent of being collaborative. And there's a really delicate balance, because what I ran into early was having done work at a largely different level. My environment at Trinity University is a Division III environment. So I always tell people that, like, yeah, I'd have to go way back into this, but I always say, like, the no worries thing is a real thing in certain environments in Australia. That's very true, right? Just like their culture. But in Division III, it can be like that. We're going to run into people who they're used to doing things a certain way. And then I was looked at as very different coming into that environment, and different to a lot of people is bad, right? So I still remember specifically having an experience with one of our teams, and the coach at the senior banquet, one of his female captains and I had gotten on very well. And at their senior banquet, one of her superlatives that he laid on her was, she speaks Daniel. And when she first told me about that comment, it made me think, it was almost insulting, because I was like, well, what are we different? We don't talk the same way that everybody else talks. And of course, like, I recognize it's a partial compliment, but it was also like, oh, they're different. So them doing things with different standards and et cetera is, that's not all of us, essentially. And that's not, it made me really second guess myself, being someone who runs a little bit anxious, and whether or not I was putting out collaborative vibes, or they just thought I was there just to, be about myself or something like that. So I've had the same experience, I think, with force plates. Is what was really interesting with force plates is I kind of reverse engineer my process, where I started out coaching. And because I worked with a lot of youth, middle school, high school athletes for the bulk of my career, when I first dove into working every day with force plates, I was taking my coach lens and then trying to deconstruct it. And so I basically had a technical model I was working from, which I always emphasize to people needs to come first. And then I was working backwards into, okay, when I say this is important, how does that come through objectively in a test with force platforms? And I found that the learning curve with that was fast. It was really easy to identify what differentiated better jump performance, and what was really more of a characteristic element of specific phases of different jump tests with the force platforms. So that was an interesting experience. And I think a lot of people assumed that I was more of a sports scientist, and then it would take me a while to get them to understand that I was really a coach who was bringing sports science into that perspective. And I think that was one of the things that in the consulting that I did that was really helpful to smooth out the process for me, and became very collaborative. I'd like to think I spent the better part of the last 6 years at Trinity engaging people in the same fashion, where what might have come across as being different is now understood as being somebody who just really wants to help us, do savage things competitively, that is.
Daniel, how much of the assessment data you get from the force plates, do you have different templates in terms of exercise prescription? And I would suspect that if you take that data, you can individualize the training process probably a lot more effectively. Have you been able to do that into a team setting, which sometimes is difficult with so many people at one time?
Yeah, I think the short answer I would say is no. The longer answer is that having that element, it's really getting buy-in to, because ultimately it's like, it's what we know about when people, are first diving into strength conditioning or sports sciences. They're like, oh, I want my team to be faster. I want them to be stronger. It's like, there's not an athlete that's not the case. And then it becomes how far can we get into the details? How precise can we be with analysis to tell us what we're not currently doing well? And then the better you do with that part of the process, the more important it is that I would say you under communicate it, but you try to find the ways to make the biggest shift in that. Like, you don't have to go in, because my mistake early on, especially in an environment like Trinity, where I was the first strength and conditioning coach ever, as a full-time staff member. My mistake was going in and thinking that I was gonna catch everybody up on the sports science elements, where really they just wanted to know if I was going to help them win. And so with respect to that, I think I just have a really specific physical vibe in how I engage athletes when I'm coaching them. And in part, I think when I was first starting at Trinity is that I kind of moved away from that. And I got into thinking that I needed to kind of catch everybody up on what we were going to do on the science and on the understanding of it, where really we needed to engage process and then use that as the way to get them to shift to being like, well, yes, that's sports science, but it's not something we have to talk about a bunch. It's just what we do. It's kind of, you could frame it this way. I always say, like, you could call sports science sometimes, like people call it invisible monitoring, or those like which I always relate to like antivirus software in a computer. It's like, it's not why you have a computer, but it's in the background to make sure that everything's operate efficiently, right? It's like you've got other reasons to operate the way that you do, but you've always got that security, and you've always got something there that that provides a degree of protection as well as insight. With all that said, I realized that was a mouthful. If I point that back to Ernie, because Ernie's always been one that's sets my hair on fire when we engage that. How have your challenges at Louisville been different relative to Utah? And is that something, what are the consistencies? What are the differences?
Yeah, good question. I think that, probably just differences in culture. I've been in the West my whole life, and so there's a unique culture here, and also just differences in how things come to fruition. So, like, a lot of what we accomplished at University of Utah was being driven from the ground up to the leadership, and sometimes that would kind of go on deaf ears with the leadership. And my perception here has been it's kind of the opposite, where the leadership, not just in athletics, but in different domains, like in the university and the healthcare system, they're the ones who are trying to drive this better way of doing things. And I maybe I shouldn't say better way of doing things, but drive this vision of comprehensive integration, where it's not about who's doing this or who's doing that, but it's about, like, the fact that we need to get the job done, and that we're always going to be limited on resources. And there's just this big universe of experts that are right here within arm's reach to all of us within academia and the healthcare system. And so seeing that from the leadership perspective going down, and then helping everyone who's, boots on the ground working with the athletes and the sports every day to grab on and to this idea of comprehensive integration, where we really want to share the work for the benefit of the athlete. Like, so that's probably been the biggest shift. And then the other big thing for me, like the big growth opportunity for me, would be that just the idea that we're no longer just like working with and trying to sell your department like sports science just to the athletic administrators, but now we're trying to sell health and performance to several leaders of several different industries. And that is a unique challenge, because if you are talking to the CEO of a hospital, you need to know what that hospital's mission and vision and values are, and what that CEO's values are. If you're talking to the dean of academic department in a university, you need to know what they're about. If you're talking to the AD, you need to know what they're about. And so that's probably been one of the biggest areas of growth for me in this. And it's one former colleague I just saw at a conference once. I just saw him a few weeks ago, and he said something that really stood out, and that's when it really hit me. Was he's like, sometimes you can't bring your expectations from one place to the new place, because everything's going to be different in the new place. And if you bring your expectations with you, then you're going to run into a lot more barriers. And he said, you know, I'm at my 5th school, and this is the 5th time I brought my expectations with me, and it kicked my butt. And that's when it hit me. I'm like, no kidding. We need to leave those expectations behind and really start with a clean slate and just try to work through it and see what you're dealing with and work through that. So I might toss that over to Ted, that same concept. And given Ted, you're someone who has had the opportunity to get, look inside a lot of different programs. You've seen a lot of different change. So in what ways have you seen like different organizations in the NFL or elsewhere be really, really successful with when new staff come on or when there's change versus like what ways have you seen it not go so well? And then maybe what are some of the factors that you see there?
I think when the expectations are not communicated properly from the get-go, usually that's the biggest stumbling block, because then I don't think the collaboration moves as smoothly as it should. So I think from the get-go, there has to be a clear direction of what's expected of that person, within that organization. And also, depending upon what your role in that organization is, you really have to reach out and communicate with those people that you're technically serving to figure out how they want to be communicated with. From a data analytics standpoint, let's just say within the NFL, usually where I see failures is it all goes back to communication. And it's not that the person's not good at their job. It's that the person that they're technically serving doesn't find them of use because they can't communicate the information that the coach needs. So to your point, from the get-go, you got to find out what the mission is, and that has to be communicated to all those people involved.
Well, since this is research to reps, one thing we might actually be talking about, I believe, Tuckman's model of storming and norming, forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. And there's a lot of research around that. And I think that's probably where some of this conversation is. But if we wanted to get down to the rep level and the training X's and O's, if it's okay with everyone, I'm going to pivot this conversation a little bit. And I want to go over to Daniel. Daniel, like you said, you've always been someone who's disruptive in my mind, and it's cool to hear your story at Trinity. But with regard to training right now, when it comes to like some of the research that might be coming out in a certain area, like, and what's one area that where you're really trying to like bring the research you're doing or the research that's coming from peer-reviewed literature onto the weight room floor there at Trinity in a way that you think is cutting edge?
Oh, it's a good question. It's funny when we, I would say that I've been far more concerned with the fundamentals for pretty much the duration of my time at Trinity than I have been in thinking that I was going to get anywhere close to something that's cutting edge. Just for all the same reasons that I was talking about, and for everything that we're talking about previously, which I hate to almost pivot that conversation back. I think I'm going to get back to that, but that's one of the big things for me is knowing those failures around communication, and then some of my own learning on it. Two of my favorite books. One is Tribal Leadership, which talks all about, connection and disconnection in an organization being primarily related to how we communicate with each other and how people feel either valued or not. And then the other book that's a much more fun read is Alan Alda's If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face? It's a fantastic read on how people think that we're communicating clearly, and yet we default to technical jargon and just kind of sounding like experts as opposed to sounding like somebody who values, the person in front of you and, trying to, meet them where they are essentially. With that said, right, like if you have those communication elements in place, which I think is also kind of a cop out, is to do that, then getting people to be more in touch with the idea of preparedness and readiness, which is the thing that we struggle with the most. Our transition periods can be extreme because in the Division 3 model, we only have their primary competitive season and what used to be a 5-week period in the off season, where we can mandate training. Everything that falls outside of that is voluntary, and you're going to get different degrees of compliance depending on how coaches communicate for themselves how voluntary that is, right? Which we all know that coaches can be magical with language around creating standards for their programs. And then some people have just been less concerned with that. So getting everyone to understand and be on the same page around the cost of intensifying a training load before an athlete has had the time to develop some of the foundations, has had time to adjust to heightened expectations, especially like we've seen a pronounced increase in competitiveness over the past, I would say decade, specific to my, I've felt it in the past 6 years, but and the way that I would communicate that is just saying that, for a program like us, where we're an oversized athletic department relative to our campus size, we're almost 25% of the student population, that our competitive landscape is such that we should absolutely win conference in every sport, every time. It should be like, that's where we're at right now. But when we get to the NCAA playoffs, that's actually really where the competition starts. And so getting people to understand that and to have the idea that we can be a little bit more intentional and deliberate around these transition periods, and we're not going to lose out big, but we can compromise ourselves by being too aggressive with some of those changes and not accepting that people, didn't maintain standards when it was their autonomy that allowed them to do that. The fact that they had a choice and people make a poor choice regarding, being physically prepared as a student athlete. That's just a reality for the environment that I'm in. So everything that relates to being able to better articulate what readiness represents, and force plates can be a big part of that. I think there's way more valuable stuff that comes in before in terms of the language, most of which I think I would just simply articulate as getting people to understand. I would say like their best opportunity at being successful is having a PhD in themselves as an athlete, as a student athlete, and understanding that if they're in touch with their needs and they've done the work, then it's way easier to communicate with others about how they can help you. With all of that being said, I have a tendency to go in a few different directions at once. It's just kind of how my brain works. If I bring Pat back into the discussion, I'm pretty fascinated with just how you opened everything and how we talked about that. And if there's anything you can give me concrete about staff development that relates to, like what you said in terms of disrupting the status quo and then being able to build what you see as being something that will help you differentiate, help you to show the value, demonstrate value in your organization.
Yeah, I think you have to know. So there has to be a vision and a mission. And you have to know your why. So as the leader, you got to know what your purpose is. And then because that's going to be a lens you see things through. When you're trying to help staff, it's the same thing. You're trying to communicate to them the vision, the mission, the objectives, the goals, but you have to understand their purpose as well. You have to help them to understand their purpose. Then there comes the development part. Like, you have to know where you are and where you're going. All right, let's develop a plan to get there. But we're not getting there alone. So there are others that are taking this journey with us, and we all have to be moving in the same direction. Some people are moving in the opposite direction. Some people are pulled over and they're parked. Some people are taking a break. Some people are tired, they're out of gas. Some people are speeding. Some people are crossing over lanes, not using signals. Some people are upset at those people. Some people are road raging. Like, it's a lot going on as we try to go in this direction that we should be headed. How do we communicate that? You know, it's kind of like, you know, you used to have the my dad's a retired truck driver, and they have the CB system. They used to, at least. And you're trying to communicate, hey, what's going on at mile marker number 10? Or, hey, we got a little bit of backup traffic going here. Hey, everyone get over to the right lane. Hey, you might want to get off at exit 33. There's something going on. Hey, all clear. Those things are, that type of communication helps people keeps people safe. It gives them a sense of comfort. They understand that they're not out there by themselves. So it's the same way with the people that are in a health and performance department. Like, we have a very large health and performance department with sports medicine. You got your athletic trainers, and sports nutrition, your dietitians, sports science, the different positions that are coming online, your mental health therapist, your mental performance specialist, and your athletic performance, sports performance, strength and conditioning coaches, along with team physicians. And everyone's trying to help the athlete be safe and perform well. Well, different people have different levels of expertise, experience, ideas, philosophies, and getting all of that to work is a daily effort. It's something where I can tell you, here's how to put it into practical terms. As I'm driving into work, I go, who have I not talked to the most recent? What do I have for them? What information do I need from them? How can I help them? And then I work backwards all the way to the person who I've spoken to or interacted with most recently. And some people are more frequent as they move their way to the top in that sort of interaction and communication, but I can't leave anyone behind because when people feel left out or out of the loop, it takes so much more effort to re-engage them, to build that trust, that communication. And it's not just with me, but it's them with each other. So it's constantly trying to, our athletics director asked a question, how many teams do we have in our athletics department? Like, it's hundreds of teams in athletics department, not just the 23 sports teams. There's all these teams of teams and teams within teams. It's constant, and there's a human element to all of this. And then there's ego and insecurity and a host of other ideas and emotions and that go along with it. And you have to enjoy that. So for me, I have to be a person that enjoys the development of other people and the process. And so I can have patience in that process. It's a lot different than the role I was in as a strength and conditioning coach. Although there are some similarities, you never expected an athlete to be where they were going to be day one as they would be in 4 years. You shouldn't expect that. And it's the same thing with people. It's the same thing. A lot of times we expect them to be where they should be at day one, and it's a process. But with that, you as a coach were developing as well because you were learning from your athletes. I'm learning from my assistants. My assistants are learning from me. Assistants are learning from each other. I'm learning from other leaders, and we have to continue to move forward. So I can keep going probably because I'm passionate about that question. It's something that I enjoy every day. When I go to work, I'm thinking when I come home, it's the same way. How can I help someone else to do their job?
That was a great response, Pat. That was great. I'll go back to an experience that I had with Mike Boyle. I was sitting down and having a beer with Mike, and I asked him, I said, man, Mike, I don't understand how he runs one of his main deals is, besides running a gym, is running his business online, is strengthcoach.com. And I was like, how do you deal with the same questions, every single week, when you just know it's the fundamentals and it's laid out in your book as clear as day, and and people, and he says, it's just like coaching. You just got to accept people where they are, and then understand that if they didn't understand it, then something hasn't clicked yet. And if you want to be a part of helping them in that process, then it means putting aside whatever your expectations are and what you think they should already know, and just accepting them where they are and then moving on. And that represented a maturity. This conversation was a long time ago, but it was a maturity that I didn't have at the time. I expected that everyone was going to level up quickly in my presence. And then you realize after a little while that that part's not up to you, and I read a great book last year called Energy Rising. And she talked about a couple of different things, but one of the ways that she phrased, this subject was, she said, your job is not to motivate, your job is to be motivated, and then use that energy to attract people to your mission and to your vision, and then one of the other ways she communicated something like that, and this particularly in the past couple of years, I had some personal challenges and struggles. I went through a divorce that really just leveled me. And in going through that, one of the ways she phrased it, she said, how can you offer belonging if you don't feel like you belong? And that really hit me, because there was a point where I felt like, because of my struggle, it was hard for me to show up. And, I would be professional, but I would say there was a part of my passion and my heart that really kind of sunk for a little while. And I felt like I did not belong anymore. I didn't feel like I could deliver the energy the way that I wanted to show up. I was not able to. And that was a real struggle to get myself back in the frame of mind to be able to to do the work that you should not do this job if you cannot bring passion to it. You can just do something else and just punch a clock or whatever it is. But if you want to be involved in changing people, then you got to be willing to change in those areas where you sense it's not good for you.
I love that. I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, we talk about, kind of putting things out there, and appreciate you putting that out there. One of the things I think we all love about this podcast is we actually let the conversation go wherever it goes. And if anything, I'm hearing this is about people. And this is the Research to Reps Roundtable, but people make all of this work. The people that we work with, and then making sure we know who we are in the process, not getting lost in that. With that, I want to hear a side of you, and I want you to get real down and nerdy with us. You heard it, down and nerdy. I want you to break down one of your research topics, whether it's reactive strength index, whether it's velocity-based training, or power and capacity and volleyball. Just pick one of those and go extreme nerd on us, and let's see what you got.
Okay. So if we said, I know reactive strength index is always something that people get really excited about. It's just fun to say, right? Reactive strength and reactive strength index. But anyway, one of the ways that I communicate reactive strength is in the way that it's measured. You have meters and you have seconds. So meters is what? Meters is how high. How high do they go? Seconds is how fast, right? The difference is that if you're assessing the stretch shortening cycle in something like a depth or a drop jump performance, you're now just looking at contact time. And so it's just a flash and it goes by really fast. And so how that's measured and what they're actually doing is fundamentally different than what they're doing when they do a counter movement jump and they do what's called the reactive strength index modified, or what's sometimes called modified reactive strength index, because that one is from the start of movement to takeoff. And why that's important is because they're both meters per second. So people have scrutinized the reactive strength index modified measure because they're like, well, it's just velocity. Meters per second is velocity. So why do I need to do, it's redundant, right? Like you've got takeoff velocity, you know, in your jump performance. And it's like, well, the reason that that's important is because contextually how people deliver is different than what they'll deliver. So takeoff velocity jumpers are always going to be your biggest jumpers. Whoever has the highest takeoff velocity is going to jump the highest, right? That's a fact. So that's one of your most important measures. But how they get there will vary widely in terms of the positions that they're utilizing. And that could potentially disadvantage them in how they show up in their sport. For instance, in Olympic weightlifting, we know that Olympic weightlifters are, you know, sometimes legendary jumpers, right? You can see that they just have the capacity. You take away the bar and that explosive movement from the ground up and put them into a vertical jump condition and they can sky. But the difference is they're used to using very deep knee angles and generally loading in a slower pattern in that downward phase and the eccentric and the braking phase than athletes who are quote unquote more reactive, right? They don't ride the brakes or they don't slam the brakes as hard and fast as athletes who are more proficient in deceleration. So that's something where being able to differentiate across that can allow you to be more surgical with your training interventions. So for instance, like the thing that was really important to me was early on, we identified what I would call fast jumper versus what's a fast finisher. A fast finisher is the one I'm talking about, the classic high jumper who they might jump slower, but their finish is faster. And that means that they're going to have the highest vertical jump. So, you know, in something like the NFL Combine, that's the only thing they're measuring is who jumped the highest. But if we take the time component into it, then that can become a differentiator. And that's what we're looking at. And a lot of times, again, their positions that they're going to utilize, the shapes they're going to make could be different. So on something like in the NBA with rebounding, right, then that might be more biased towards the time side of the equation. If they can do a comparable jump, not even the best jump, but in less time, then that could actually be, you know, their primary differentiator. And so things like that just give you the ability to demonstrate that it's not always about having the loudest drums, right? As much as we love, you know, AC/DC, et cetera, and bands that bring the heat, that there's a subtlety to something like classical music and subtlety to other tones and other rhythms that are going to be displayed. And so that's early on, I think we used a couple of examples. One was from an elite Premier League athlete, and our case study was essentially comparing that elite Premier League athlete to a gold medalist in Olympic weightlifting. And we just showed that their metrics are completely different. Like how they jump is completely different and they're valued differently. But my thing is when you looked at their training background, the Olympic weightlifter, because their development is extremely comprehensive, is way, way better positioned to make the next step with plyometric interventions. So if you train an Olympic weightlifter with plyometrics, they would have the capacity to develop those braking qualities in an extremely short fashion, a very short window, where a Premier League athlete, based on the profiles that I'm talking about, where they would be what we call a fast jumper, where they don't jump as high, but they get through the whole jump much faster, they would have a more difficult time because they'd have to explore shapes and positions that may not be as well developed, especially historically. I mean, less so now with the Premier League and international soccer. I think we've seen that it's been professionalized to another degree where they lift and they train, and it's far more comprehensive than it was, you know, in the late 90s and early 2000s. It's still an uphill battle at times, right? With the way that cultures can lag. Soccer is not always a sport that's going to value the weight room as highly as a sport like football and even baseball and basketball at this point. But I think that they're getting there, and part of getting there is getting them to understand that you want what you're testing to be able to differentiate better performers in specific tasks. And that's always something that, you know, force plates are going to be a great indicator for that. The reactive strength index across, you know, a drop jump compared to a counter movement jump test will be a great way to get started. And then being able to apply that to the technical model is what I always emphasize, is making sure that, you let them understand that, what got them here won't get them there. Wherever the goal is that to be able to do that, like we have to optimize across a couple of different levels. Is that nerdy enough?
That went there. That went there.
Okay.
Does anyone have a follow-up?
I do. So at the beginning of this, Ted just he mentioned how he's just gone to the Senior Bowl, and you're trying to combine the expert eye with objectivity. And Daniel, you just commented a little bit on how some different metrics are going to here, this is what the Premier League performers seem to be able to do. So there's a bit of a transfer coefficient there, where like you test them, that transfer isn't going to be perfect in the real world sport. And
yep.
And like we know from several research studies that have been done, at least on the NFL Combine data, that many of the tests that are done in the NFL Combine don't transfer that well to real life on-field performance. And so what we're talking about is like these athletes at the Combine, like they're the best that college football has to offer the NFL every year, and their data in these tests does not necessarily transfer that well to what their NFL performance is going to be. So my question for you is, Ted and Daniel, if you know, like what's emerging? Like, are there certain metrics that are being captured in that type of field testing setting, or where you bring the lab to the field? Like force plates are a good example of bringing the lab to the field now because they're everywhere. But is there anything happening in that setting that is really saying like, you know what, here's some emerging data that's saying like maybe these are some metrics that we need to be looking at that correspond better to performance? Or are we getting to a point where the data on physical performance that we are now able to collect in the field of play with different technologies, like, is that actually more important, or does that have a higher transfer to performance?
I'll say this. There was one team, and it's a good team. They're been in the playoffs, I think, the last 6 years. So when their general manager got hired, he asked each position coach to do video cut-ups of what he's looking for in his position. And because he goes, I want my scouts to have their eyes trained for what you want. So I don't think it's there yet, but I think eventually you would have, say, almost like an avatar, what you're looking at for each position relative to the actual movements on the field, and to figure out how much an athlete that's in college correlates to that avatar. So I don't think it's there yet, but I think that would be something that probably within the next 5-10 years will be more of a possibility with, the way technology improves each year.
Yeah,
so
if I follow up.
We take, back in the day, we could have taken Deacon Jones and superimposed, Pat Ivey over him, and to see how much they correlated. And we said, this guy's an NFL player.
I don't know about that one, Ted. Yeah, Deacon Jones, the head slap. I mean, like he had a move outlawed. Like how many athletes did something that created a rule that no one else can do it ever again? I mean, that's Deacon Jones.
Yeah.
Wow. That's in case you all don't know, you need to YouTube Deacon Jones head slap. That was his pass rush move. Obviously with concussion and brain health, that move is you can't do that. You can't blow to the head.
There was some players that actually lost hearing from his head slaps.
I believe it. Vicious. If I could jump into that, I think a lot of times we have varying degrees, and I think we can accept that. One of the things that a good friend of mine, Landon Evans, is famous to me for saying emphatically is study nature at nature's level. So I think we have to have a sensitivity to what's occurring on the field in this case, as we're discussing. But our capacity and our ability to deconstruct it, it always comes down. So you have the data and you have analysis, right? And those are complementary processes that are not always able to be completed in a timely fashion that will support a real competition process, right? And that's occurred. The original story with ForceDex was that they had Dr. Daniel Cohen, and been involved in the testing of Manchester United's team, and they went to the team, got approval to run these tests, did the tests. It took them, I think it was maybe 6 months to analyze the data. And then you go back to the coach and says, "Oh, hey, look, we've done all this great analysis." And the coach is like, "It's utterly useless now, right?" Like it's like the old, I don't know if it's a Buddhist proverb, but it says, "No man enters the same river twice," because the man's changed and the river's changed. So that the ability to implement things that way, I think, is still eluding us for obvious reasons, is because that context changes so quickly for lots of reasons. So I think what we end up trying to do is deconstruct some of that and see how the integrity of that holds up. And that, like I said, when I speak to the fundamentals, I think that's exactly what I've been trying to do, is just taking some pretty basic tests. And I always call it, if you guys are familiar with Bruce Lee, I always refer to it specifically with force plates as force plates being your 1-inch punch, which is his standing in place, standing an inch from somebody and being able to just obliterate them with a hand movement, because he's trained his body to do that. So, because if you look at the way people jump in sports, and then the way that they'll jump on some of our tests, because we, we'll do things like have them jump with their hands on their hips, you'll see that change behavior pretty much immediately. I was doing a national team training camp with Canada's men's basketball team. I was up there with Charlie Weingroff, who was their strength coach at the time. And we put them through a few performance tests on the force plates. They had an entire process. It was a really well-run operation. And I remember watching one guy specifically who just obviously, we keep the instructions, I always say like sanitized or hygienic, where we say, okay, keep your hands on your hips, jump as high as you can, as fast as you can. And this guy gave the most, the most ridiculous effort at a vertical jump that you would imagine. He just kind of he barely bent his knees and just kind of, he interpreted the test instructions in a weird way. And I'm not inclined at that time to make an adjustment with people when we're trying to keep the instructions the same for everyone. So we went back through and I kind of re-explained the instructions to him and said, okay, we want you to jump the way that you can, but we want you to jump high and fast, right? So you just kind of re-emphasize, try to say it slightly differently. Anyway, we went through the test and he still, didn't really get the instructions, but then he moseys over to the basketball court right next to him and takes the ball, and without barely any body motion at all, manages to dunk it just like basically from a standstill, just very extremely explosively. So I always characterize that as like what we call like a zoo tiger, jungle tiger phenomenon, where the zoo tiger is the one that's there for show. And that can be when people say they're testing force plates, sometimes that's what it is. It's just for show. And you know that the value of the data is limited because you can't differentiate some of those performances. You can't truly differentiate with the data. So it's mostly for show, where everyone knows if you run into a tiger in the jungle, that's things have gotten serious, right? And when the training and the preparation doesn't reflect what's happening in competition, or the capacity to really relate well to that, meaning it doesn't have to be exactly like, that's the thing we always get for scrutiny is like, well, can I use my arms? Can I run and, jump and do that? I'm like, well, yeah, you can do that, but you've changed so many elements, so many variables that now it's no longer an apples to apples comparison relative to our norms. So, being able to get closer to competitive performance is important, but so is being able to deconstruct the process to where the main thing that I emphasize to people is, can you do those things? Can you introduce those things on day one? Where we know a vertical jump test done the way that we're talking about, I can get pretty clean insights into the athlete's process and the team's performance. Where if I allow more complexity to enter that equation too early, I'm going to have a hard time truly, analyzing the data in a successful way, right? Something like a drop jump test is also a great example of that, because on a drop jump, you'll see some pretty aberrant performances. You'll see some people hit the ground like a brick. They don't really understand that idea of like being elastic all the time and dropping from a box and then being able to jump from that. So most of us would not advocate using drop jumps on day one with people who we may not have coached or had spent any time with. But you could do the 10-5 repeat jump test, which is just where you stand in place and you do 10 repeat jumps in place. And that one athletes respond to earlier in the process with far better performance. And it doesn't quite have the same capacity to demonstrate reactive strength and that fast stretch shortening cycle capability as well as a drop jump test would. But it allows you to get some data earlier in the process on day one, and be able to add some insight and some value to the discussion.
I've got a question for you, Daniel, and this is to add to a discussion we've been having. Can you talk about the impact? So when you talk about readiness and preparedness,
Yes, sir.
can you talk about the impact on, so I'm going to use some layman's terms. You got fresh legs, you got dead legs. You have someone who may be in a fatigued state. And what is the impact on jumping from a fatigue state versus an optimal state? And then maybe a suggestion for remedying someone in a fatigue state, and then what that process might be to get them to be optimal.
Okay. One of the main things specific to jumping related to like fresh legs versus dead legs, right? One of the main things in identifying readiness would be just their overall contraction time, and specifically the eccentric time. That metric specifically will tend to lag. Of course, you'll have the thing that I think most of us like about the eccentric time metrics is it's pretty easy to articulate, is that it's taking you longer to work your breaks, right? You'll see some of, kind of a flattening to the overall jump performance. Like, you'll expect to see some decreases, but it's actually pretty surprising how well people hold up to fatigue with the jump test. It takes quite a bit to see anything close to a 10% reduction in jump height. You got to have somebody who's just burying themselves, or has a coach who's burying them, in order to get to those kinds of deficits a lot of the time. But relating to the process you're trying to put into place, the way that I always communicate it is saying, what we're trying to avoid is the surgery being a success, but the patient dying. And that's where like somebody feels like they're doing their job, like the coach on the field thinks the job is to deliver a highly conditioned competitive team. And so they're just crushing them with the training load in order to make that happen. But the athlete's showing up flatter and flatter every day in their testing and competitive performance, right? So that's like, you did your job well, but how that relates to the overall equation. And then it becomes quicksand, right? Now you're afraid to make any sort of changes because you've committed to this process. And so it shows the ability to adjust that can be difficult for people because, ego gets into the equation and things like that. One of the things that we have the capacity to look at is how those jump tests relate, and then how you walk someone back from fatigue. If we're thinking about if we're thinking about the readiness and preparedness element, the way I communicate it simply to coaches, teams, and athletes is saying, okay, if we jump test you and you're fresh, you're going to put out your best performance. But if I ask you to go, go run on the field for an hour or go and run 10 miles and then come back and we'll test, we'll see a change to the energetics and to the mechanics that are in place, right? And our job should be to use that information to determine a second criteria for risk and risk management, right? And then we have more insight into how athletes, how that athlete individually, maybe how athletes in that sport will respond to fatigue, and what are the mechanical, what's the mechanical fallout, energetic fallout from fatigue, right? Where I think in sports like middle distance, long distance running, that's pretty specific, where you'll see, because of the specific mechanics in place and the monotony or the cyclical nature of running, that you'll see, they're going to fatigue really specifically and not have the capacity to flex in the same way. And it's not just specific to the shape and position of, like, in a counter movement jump, what their counter movement jump would be, but also the degree of asymmetry, because most of them are going to kind of, I would call it like gallop a little bit off of one leg. One leg might be like what I'll always call is like their anchor side, is like that's where they're finding stability, and then they're just kind of rotating off of that. That we see those asymmetries become way more pronounced under fatigue. And so that's something that we can apply strategies to in terms of the restorative process that begins literally from the second that you end a practice training session, is that you try to restore, I'll call it symmetry, we could call it balance, in their mechanics as quickly as possible, so that they don't bring that into their everyday patterns and bring that into the next day's training, essentially.
Awesome. I want to kick it over to Ernie, and then he can add on, and then shoot it over to Ted to close us out. Ted, he already took your question. I think he gave us 3 books, so you might have to ask a different question. Ernie, what do you think about that?
Well, I'm going to try to tie this together. Okay. We've bounced around a lot today.
Yeah.
Dan, you talked about how one of the things you've learned is to learn how to, talk, have a valuable conversation with someone, and where we're using layman's terms, you're not being so technical. So let's just say, you're monitoring your athletes on a regular basis with the force plates. Maybe you have some other tools like wearable tech, and this has been going on for a couple weeks. Everything you're seeing is suggesting maybe like things are heading downhill. The data's lining up to give you that indication. Your athletes come to you and they're like, they walk into the weight room there at Trinity and they're just like, "Coach, my legs are dead." And this is what you're hearing from multiple athletes. But now, that sums it up for you, because you've been seeing it in the data, and now the athletes are coming to you saying that. But you got to go and have that conversation with their coach. And you have to simplify that so that coach might make a change. What's the conversation going to sound like? Let's pretend I'm the coach.
Yeah, we're role playing now. Yeah. So I think that the first thing I would tell you, Coach, is that I know that what we're doing is well intended, and I'm sure that you have a track record for being able to deliver these kinds of performances based on work, right? And the thing that we want to be sensitive to is whatever the strategy is, we've got to look at the results. And right now, what we're seeing in our monitoring process is that declines are being steadily made in most of our major indicators for what we would consider what helps help athletes be difference makers on the field. And so when we lose that, we're really blunting our edge, right? We're taking away from some of that. And again, while it's well intended, I think we have to be sensitive to what kind of adjustments would be necessary before we carry on too far. So having this conversation is really the most important step that I can have for you. And it is because I truly believe that our team has the ability to be strong, that when they don't show up that way, that we're able to have honest conversations about what it'll take to get them back on course and back on track. And so if we could talk about now, maybe some of the things that you're seeing from your end that tell you that this team is having more of an aberrant response, that they're not responding in the way that you've had teams historically change after such practices and training.
That's awesome. I really love that, Daniel. So my next question for you, but we'll be really brief because I know I want to get over to Ted, but I'm the coach and I'm okay. I agree with you. Now, the real question I have is, what modifications do I need to make? Like, okay, great. I agree. I see where you're coming from. What modifications do I need to make to make sure that we can still be productive during practice so that we can be successful and so that my players' legs aren't dead anymore?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to do is look at the buckets that are overflowing right now and look at how that relates to our history, who we've been in the past, and then how that relates to our future and how do we want to show up. And if we can narrow in on that, I'm confident that right now what we know about the sports science element of this is that fatigue masks fitness. And so I'm confident that we can find where our differentiators are hidden if we're willing to take an honest look at these characteristics, and we can decide on that together.
Over to you, Ted. Bring us home. Thanks, Daniel.
Well, Daniel, you've been great with giving us some book references along the way. But what, in particular, to a coach that might be going through some personal issues, as you've mentioned in our podcast today, what would be some books you would recommend that would assist them in dealing with some of that?
Yeah, so for last year, the book Energy Rising was a fantastic book. I know it's got a subtitle and it relates with neuroscience, so don't let that scare you away, because she uses coaching analogies throughout, even weightlifting analogies of like how difficult something could be. And so it was an excellent read. I just ran right through it, and I've recommended it and talked about it with teams, and even read passages from it to specific teams when we have the relationship in place there. I'm trying to think of, specific to the relationship stuff. Gosh, it's a complex area. I read a book called Buddhist Boot Camp from an author named Timber Hawkeye. And I'm not a Buddhist, so just to be clear, I'm not a Buddhist, and that's not what the book is about. And largely that's not what Buddhism is about, by the way. But anyway, it's called Buddhist Boot Camp, and he just has a really good way of communicating around where you feel like you're wronged and how to show compassion for that. He has a more recent book that I read that's called The Opposite of Namaste. And that one was just, the title in itself captured my attention. And if you guys indulge me on this briefly, I'll just go through exactly what the opposite of Namaste is. If you guys know yoga practice at all, I'm sure Pat, you and Ted, you guys, I'm sure, are both avid yogis. You'll recognize at least that, at the end of a yoga practice, that one of the ways that they'll close practice is they'll say namaste. And what namaste means is the divinity in me, or the spirit in me, sees the spirit in you, or the divinity in you. And so what the opposite of namaste is what it says is the ego in me sees the ego in you. And because I've had an ego, and because I've been angry, and I've been jealous, and I've been frustrated, and I've been all of these things that will lead me to misbehavior, right? That I can show compassion for your ego when those things show up, right? Because I've done these things and I've been this way, I can show greater understanding and compassion for when those things are done to me. Because that's more of the experience that we'll have in real life. You're like, yeah, that's nice for yoga class. It's the same thing with church. It's like people very peaceful in the church setting, then out in the parking lot, somebody cuts you off and it's immediately like, you can go to hell, you know? But that's just how our brains can work, is that, you know, like you've got the higher and lower brain functions. And so it's we'd like to think we're showing up as our highest selves, but obviously that's not always the experience we give to people.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much. It's been, I mean, we probably could have gone for another hour. Appreciate your time, your enlightenment, the conversation. It's been good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
I knew this would be awesome and you would steal the show. So you didn't disappoint. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on. I'm excited to have had the conversation, and yeah, grateful.
All right. Well, appreciate you all. You all take care. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care.